The lie was called peace, and its angels were machines. We called them echo frames, titans of polished chrome and ghost white armor that stood 20 meters tall, their silhouettes sharp against the alien skies of 100 subjugated worlds. They carried no weapons, for their very presence was the final word in any argument. A pilot, cradled in the amniotic gel of the command coffin, would sync their consciousness with the frame, and together they would become a broadcast, a psychic shout so loud and clear that it flattened dissent into dazed compliance. It was the voice of God spoken in the language of neurology, a wave of enforced serenity that washed over entire cities, calming riots, disarming soldiers, and turning the burning fires of rebellion into the cold ash of order. This was the foundation of the Terran hegemony, a peace not negotiated, but imposed. A quiet empire built on the amplified will of a single human mind. And I, Kalen, had once been one of those voices. I'd been the pilot of the Vigil, a mid-class echo frame, and for 7 years I had been the hegemony's whispering fist on the fringe worlds. I spoke peace into the minds of pirates and insurrectionists, my thoughts becoming their thoughts, my calm becoming their chains, until the day it broke. On Cygnus X1 during the Union Uprising, I had pushed the broadcast too deep, tried to hold 1,000,000 angry minds under my will at once, and something in them had pushed back. The psychic feedback loop had been instantaneous, a tidal wave of raw, unfiltered hatred pouring back through the frame and directly into my skull. It felt like being burned alive from the inside out, a cacophony of 1,000,000 screams, all trying to occupy the same space my soul used to be. They scraped me out of the command coffin, a gibbering wreck, the left side of my face frozen in a permanent, palsied grimace, my link to the etheric net. The psychic field all pilots touched severed and scarred. I was grounded, disgraced, a broken tool tossed onto the scrap heap of a low-orbit station called Terminus, where the hegemony sent its forgotten things to rust. I spent my days nursing cheap synthale in darkened bars, the phantom echo of those 1,000,000 screams, a constant hum behind my own thoughts. A reminder of the price of our perfect peace. It was in one of those bars, the Starlight Chasm, where the air was thick with the smoke of alien narcotics and the sweat of desperate spacers, that the lie finally cracked for everyone else to see. The news feed flickered to life on the grime-streaked holo projector above the bar, cutting through the usual stream of corporate propaganda. The face of a panicked anchor, usually so placid and controlled, filled the screen. The broadcast was live, shaky, and terrifyingly real. It was from Xylos, a dustball of a planet in the outer veil, a world designated as pre-industrial, inhabited by a species of silent, lanky bipeds the xenologists had quaintly named the Silenti. They were considered little more than fauna, a primitive culture unworthy of even a compliance broadcast. Yet, the hegemony had sent a frame anyway, a show of force to the nearby mining syndicates. They hadn't sent just any frame, they had sent the Seraphim, the pinnacle of echo technology, piloted by the best of us, the poster child for the Ether Core's Lyra. Her face, strong and serene, had been plastered on recruitment posters from Earth to the Galactic Core. Lyra, my former mentor, the one who taught me how to quiet my own mind so I could scream into the minds of others. And there, on the screen, was her angel, the magnificent Seraphim, dying. It wasn't a battle. There were no explosions, no plasma fire, no opposing war machines. The frame was just coming apart. Plates of its white armor buckled and tore away as if ripped by invisible claws. Arcane energies, the blue-white light of its psychic core, bled into the dusty air. The Titan shuddered, its movements clumsy and agonized, a dying giant swatting at ghosts. On the ground below, the Silenti simply stood, hundreds of them, their slender forms unmoving in the red twilight. They weren't fighting, they were watching. And then the sound hit, a psychic shriek that traveled through the news feed itself, a sliver of the feedback Lyra must have been experiencing. The patrons of the bar cried out, clutching their heads. For me, it was a ghost of a familiar agony, a pale echo of the storm that had broken me, but it was enough. The connection was instantaneous and horrifying. I saw through her eyes for a fraction of a second a landscape of utter silence, a psychic void so profound that it was a presence, a devouring emptiness that was pulling her mind, her soul, and her machine into nothing. The Seraphim's great head tilted back in a silent scream, and then its core went critical, erupting in a silent, blossoming flower of pure white light that vaporized everything in a 5-kilometer radius, news drone included. The feed cut to static, leaving only the stunned silence of the bar and the frantic, disbelieving face of the news anchor burned into our retinas. An echo frame had been destroyed. The invincible had been broken. The angel of peace had been murdered by a species that hadn't even invented the wheel. The hegemony's quiet empire suddenly had a very loud problem. They came for me 3 hours later. 2 Ether Core's enforcers, clad in the mirror-black armor that drank the station's neon light, found me in my cramped hab unit. They didn't knock. The door dissolved into plasma, and they stepped through the smoldering frame, their impassive helmets tracking my every move. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Their authority was as absolute as the piece we used to broadcast. They escorted me, not unkindly, but with the unyielding pressure of a hydraulic press, to a waiting shuttle. The flight was silent, the black-clad soldiers flanking me like monoliths. My destination was the Sword of Damocles, a hegemony dreadnought hanging in high orbit, its shadow eclipsing the rust bucket station I'd called home. Inside, the ship was a temple of quiet efficiency and cold, white light. The air tasted sterile, recycled, and pure, a stark contrast to the grit of Terminus. They led me to the command deck, a vast chamber where the cosmos swirled in a 360-degree holographic display. Standing before the star-dusted abyss was Director Valerius, the iron-willed patriarch of the Ether Core. His hair was silver, his face a roadmap of hard decisions, and his eyes held the weary gravity of a man who held an empire on his shoulders. He didn't turn to face me, his gaze fixed on the ghost of Xylos in the star chart. "Kalen," he said, his voice a low rumble. "You look like hell." I touched the numb side of my face, the flesh that wouldn't quite obey my commands. Feedback leaves a mark. Director, you taught us that. He finally turned, and his eyes, cold and analytical, swept over me, cataloging the damage. Lyra is dead. The Seraphim is a crater of radioactive glass. We have a dozen analysts trying to piece together what happened from the final telemetry fragments. They are all suffering from acute psychic trauma. 2 are already brain dead. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. We have the frame's neural core. What's left of it? It's a psychic black box, a recording of her last moments. We need someone to interface with it, to sift through the chaos and tell us what she saw, what she felt. Everyone we've tried has been broken by it. My blood ran cold. He wanted me to dive back into the storm. You want to plug me into a feedback loop that killed Lyra, the best pilot you ever had? No. Valerius corrected, his voice dangerously soft. She was the most stable, the most controlled, the strongest. But you were always the most sensitive. You touched the etheric net deeper than anyone. That's why the feedback shattered you so completely, but it's also why you might be the only one who can survive this. You're already broken. Kalen. What's one more crack in the mirror? He wasn't asking. It was an order wrapped in the guise of a desperate plea. He was pointing a gun at my head and telling me I was the only one who could understand the bullet. I thought of Lyra, of the easy confidence she had, the way she believed in the hegemony's mission with a purity I had always envied and secretly distrusted. I thought of her dying in a storm of psychic silence, alone in the cockpit of her angel. I owed her a witness. Fine, I rasped, the word tasting like rust. Hook me up to your ghost. They took me to a sterile, white med bay, the kind of room where hope and life support fluid were dispensed in equal, measured doses. The neural core of the seraphim sat on a pedestal in the center of the room, a sphere of blackened, cracked crystal, pulsing with a faint, sickly light. It looked like the heart of a dead god. The techs, their faces grim and professional, strapped me into a harness, slick with conductive gel, and attached a crown of silver needles to my scalp. The hum of the machine around me was a low thrum of dread. "We can only give you 90 seconds, one of the techs said, his voice tight. Any longer, and the psychic resonance will cause catastrophic neural decay. We'll pull you out the second you hit the mark." I just nodded, closing my eyes, trying to shore up the fractured walls of my own mind. Valerius's voice came over the intercom, disembodied and cold. "Begin the interface." The world dissolved. There was no gentle transition, no slow immersion. One moment I was in a medbay. The next I was fire and screaming silence. I was Lyra. I was inside her head, feeling the smooth, familiar hum of the seraphim around me, the effortless connection to a machine that was an extension of my own body. I felt her confidence, her unwavering belief in her purpose. We were on Xylos, the red dust swirling outside the armored viewport. Our mission, a simple compliance broadcast to pacify the region. She extended her senses through the frame, reaching out with her mind, preparing to speak the hegemony's peace into the planet's soul. And then she touched them. The Silenti. It was not like touching another mind. It was like touching a hole in reality. There was nothing there. No thoughts to read, no emotions to soothe, no psychic presence to overwhelm. There was only absence. A complete and total void. Her powerful broadcast, the psychic shout that could quell 1,000,000,000 minds, poured into that emptiness and simply vanished. There was no echo, no resistance, just a devouring null state. The frame's systems, designed to modulate their output based on the psychic resistance of the target, went into overdrive. It was trying to fill a void that was infinite. It was like trying to fill the ocean with a single cup of water. The power draw spiked. Alarms screamed. But they were silent alarms, registered only in her mind. I felt her confusion turn to panic. The emptiness was pushing back, not with force, but with its own nature. The silence was resonating with the psychic hum of the frame's core, creating a harmonic dissonance, a wave of anti-sound, anti-thought that was shaking the very fabric of her connection. The angel was being unsung. I saw through her eyes as the Silenti emerged from the dust storms, their featureless faces turned towards her. They weren't weapons. They were mirrors, reflecting her own power back at her as a perfect, annihilating negative. She tried to sever the connection, to shut down the broadcast, but it was too late. The silence had her. It was in her head, eating her thoughts, erasing her name, her memories, her very being. The last thing I felt was her terror, a pure, crystalline spike of it, as she realized that her consciousness, amplified by the might of the seraphim, was about to be snuffed out by the collective, silent non-thought of 1,000 primitive creatures standing in the dust below. It wasn't a weapon that killed her. It was a philosophy, a state of being so alien that our most powerful tool of control was turned into a catalyst for its own destruction. The 90 seconds were up. I felt the agonizing pull of the extraction, like being dragged through barbed wire, back to my own broken body. I gasped, ripping off the neural crown, the sterile air of the medbay burning my lungs. The Tex and Valerius rushed in, their faces a mixture of fear and anticipation. "What did you see?" Valerius demanded, his hands gripping my shoulders. "What did they use?" I looked up at him, the left side of my face twitching uncontrollably, the ghost of a million screams in my ears now joined by a new, more terrible sound, the sound of utter silence. "They didn't use anything," I choked out, my voice raw. "They are the weapon. Our piece is just a type of noise. Director, a loud, complicated noise, and they are the silence that breaks it. Our angels can't fly where there is no air to beat their wings." I started to laugh then, a dry, rattling sound that tore from my throat. All our power, our entire empire of enforced serenity, was a song, and the Silenti were a race that could hear the one note that could unmake the entire melody. The hegemony hadn't just lost its best pilot, it had discovered that its god was mortal, and I was the only one who had stood in its tomb and walked out alive. My exile was over, but I had just been damned to something far, far worse. My revelation did not bring chaos. There was no panic on the command deck, no frantic scramble for answers. The hegemony was a machine too vast and too self-assured to be rattled by a single, inconvenient truth. Instead, a chilling quiet descended upon the sword of Damocles, a quiet that felt less like peace and more like the intake of breath before a final, damning verdict. They put me in a sterile observation suite, a room of soft white light and no sharp edges, the kind of place they put valuable assets that have become unstable. For 3 days, I was a ghost in their machine, poked and prodded by medtechs who treated my mind like a malfunctioning engine, their questions clinical and detached. They mapped the psychic scars, measured the resonance of the silence still humming in my neural pathways, and recorded my fragmented nightmares. All the while, the official story was being woven. News feeds across the hegemony reported that the Seraphim had been destroyed by a previously unknown geological phenomenon on Xylos, a freak psychic energy pocket that had caused its core to overload. Lyra was a hero, a tragic victim of the untamed perils of the frontier. It was a neat, clean lie, one that cauterized the wound and preserved the myth of the invincible echo frames. But on the dreadnought, the truth was a contagion, and I was patient zero. On the fourth day, Valerius summoned me again. This time, it wasn't the command deck. It was a smaller and more intimate chamber deep within the ship's strategic heart, a room known only as the Inquisitor's Chamber. The walls were made of a dark, non-reflective metal that seemed to swallow the light, and the only furniture was a circular table at which Valerius sat with two other figures. One was a decorated fleet admiral, a woman with a face like hammered granite and the cold, dead eyes of someone who had ordered exterminations. The other was a civilian, a man who seemed jarringly out of place. He was slender, with a scholar's soft hands and a face that was more curious than concerned. This was Dr. Harris Thorne, the lead xenotheorist at the Ether Cores Institute, the man who had written the very doctrines on psychic pacification that Lyra and I had been trained to execute. Kalen. Valerius began, his voice flat and devoid of preamble. Tell them what you told me. I recounted the 90 seconds in Lyra's mind, the feeling of the void, the devouring silence, the way the Seraphim had been unmade not by a force, but by the utter lack of one. I spoke of the Silenti as mirrors, as a psychic black hole that our power could not fill, only fall into. When I finished, the silence in the room was a pale imitation of the one I was describing. The Admiral was the first to speak, her voice a low growl. A species that is a walking null field, an anti-psychic entity. It's a biological impossibility. And yet, a 20 billion credit echo frame is currently a cloud of incandescent vapor on a planet you classified as harmless. Dr. Thorne countered gently, his eyes fixed on me. Impossibilities, Admiral, are simply truths we have not yet accepted. Tell me, Kalen. He leaned forward, his gaze intense. When you felt this absence, was there any intent, any malice, or was it simply a state of being? The question caught me off guard. The hegemony didn't deal in intent. It dealt in compliance. It was empty, I said, struggling for the words. It wasn't hostile. It was just there. Like a hole is there. You don't blame a hole for being empty. You just fall into it if you're not careful. We weren't careful. We tried to fill it with our voice, and the hole didn't even notice. So they're an evolutionary dead end that happens to be fatal to our primary strategic asset. The Admiral scoffed. The solution is simple. We can't use an echo frame fine. A single orbital bombardment will turn that entire continent. And these Silenti into glass. Problem solved. And what happens? Admiral, Thorne replied, his voice still calm but edged with steel. When we encounter another species like this, or worse, what if a rival power learns to replicate this state? What if the Sin Federation develops a silence torpedo? You can't solve a philosophical problem with kinetic weapons. This isn't an enemy. It's a paradigm shift. We have built an empire on the power of our voice, and we have just discovered a race that is deaf. We must understand it. Valerius had remained silent, his steepled fingers hiding his mouth, his eyes moving between the Admiral and the Doctor, weighing their arguments. Finally, his gaze settled on me. The Council has authorized Operation Stethoscope, he said, the name itself a chilling indication of their new approach. We are not going back to Xylos to conquer. We are going back to listen to the silence. A research mission, the Admiral said. Incredulous. We will send a single, unmarked stealth vessel, the Whisper. Valerius continued, ignoring her. A team of specialists. Doctor, Thorn will lead the scientific contingent, and you, Kalen, will be their guide. My scarred face tightened. Guide, I'm no xenologist. I was a pilot. You are no longer a pilot, Valerius stated, his words like chips of ice. You are the only human being to have psychically interfaced with the Lenti phenomenon and retained cognitive function. You are a living sensor. Your scars are now your primary qualification. You will go with them to the surface. You will wear a neural inhibitor to protect you from full-blown feedback, but it will be calibrated to allow you to feel the edges of the void, to detect its proximity and intensity. You will be our early warning system, our canary. The humiliation was a physical blow. A pilot of an echo frame was a god of the mind, a bringer of order. Now I was to be a glorified divining rod, a broken man sent to twitch in the presence of the thing that broke him. And the Admiral gets her way. 2, Valerius added, a flicker of something cold in his eyes. The Whisper will be escorted by my personal enforcer unit under the command of Captain Jorik. Their directive is simple. If Dr. Thorn's team cannot find a way to understand, neutralize, or weaponize the silence within a standard rotation, or if the Silenti show any sign of spreading their condition off-world, Jorik is authorized to enact Protocol 0. He will trigger a seismic charge planted in the ship's reactor core and sterilize the planet from the inside out. There will be no orbital bombardment to attract attention. Xylos will simply die, and take our team and its secrets with it. The room grew cold. It was a perfect hegemony solution, a scientific mission with a gun to its head, a quest for knowledge underwritten by the promise of total annihilation, hope and despair, sent on the same ship. I looked at Thorn, whose face had gone pale. He was a man of ideas, of theories, being handed a suicide mission. I looked at the Admiral, whose grim satisfaction was plain to see. She was getting her glassed planet, just on a delay. And I looked at Valerius, who had just sentenced me to return to the source of my own personal hell, with the fate of a world and the future of the hegemony's power resting on the frayed edges of my shattered psyche. I had no choice, and he knew it. To refuse was to be deemed useless, and the hegemony had ways of disposing of useless things. Besides, a dark, morbid curiosity had taken root in the ruins of my mind. I wanted to see them again, the silent ones. I wanted to stand before the void that had swallowed Lyra and see if it had a face. "When do we leave?" I asked. 2 weeks later, I stood in the launch bay of the Whisper. The ship was a sliver of black metal, all sharp angles and sensor-baffling surfaces, designed to be a ghost. Our team was small. Dr. Thorn and his 3 hand-picked xenobiologists, all wide-eyed idealists who looked at me with a mixture of pity and morbid fascination. And then there was Captain Jorik and his 4 enforcers. They were the opposite of the scientists. They moved with a lethal economy of motion, their black armor absorbing the light, their helmets hiding whatever humanity they had left. Jorik was a tall, lean man whose helmet was off for the briefing. His face was all sharp planes and scar tissue, and his eyes were the color of a winter sky, promising nothing but cold efficiency. He looked at me not as a person, but as a piece of volatile equipment he was forced to transport. "My team and I are responsible for your safety. Kylan," he said, his voice a low, gravelly monotone. "But more importantly, We are responsible for containment. If you show any signs of psychic instability, any indication that the phenomenon is affecting you in a way that compromises the mission or the security of this vessel, I will put you down." "Understood." "Crystal," I replied, the left side of my mouth twisting into its familiar, involuntary smirk. "Just try to make it quick. I hear the screaming gets old." He didn't react, just gave a curt nod and turned away. I was left alone for a moment, the hum of the ship's pre-flight checks vibrating through the deck. A tech handed me a simple black flight suit, a far cry from the gleaming white armor I used to wear. Tucked into a pocket was the neural inhibitor, a small, metallic disc that would adhere to the base of my skull. A leash. As I suited up, I caught my reflection in a polished bulkhead. The broken face. The haunted eyes. I was no angel of peace anymore. I was a ghost, sent to haunt another ghost, on a mission to listen to a silence that had already screamed me into ruin. The whisper detached from the dreadnought with a barely perceptible shudder, its form melting into the black of space. On the main view screen, the star chart shifted, locking onto the coordinates for the outer veil, for the graveyard of the Seraphim. We were on our way back to Xylos. The journey would take 3 weeks in the silent, sterile confines of the ship. 3 weeks for Thorne's team to review the scant data we had, for Jorik's men to endlessly run weapons diagnostics, and for me to sit with the ever-present hum of those million Cygnus screams in my head, knowing I was about to add the sound of an entire planet's silence to the cacophony. Peace had broken me. Now, I was being sent to find out if its absence could kill me. The voyage aboard the Whisper was a study in controlled tension. We were a microcosm of the hegemony itself, a fragile alliance of science and violence, all hurtling through the void towards an enigma. Thorne and his team were a constant flurry of activity, their workstation a chaotic nest of holographic schematics, genetic sequencers, and theoretical psychic models. They debated in hushed, urgent tones, building elaborate hypotheses about the Silenti based on the thinnest slivers of data. They theorized about collective consciousness, psychic hive minds, and even the possibility of a non-biological intelligence inhabiting the planet itself. They were scholars trying to describe a hurricane by studying a single drop of rain. Brilliant and utterly out of their depth. Jorik and his enforcers were the opposite. They existed in a state of suspended violence, their world reduced to the clean, cold logic of combat readiness. They spent their time in the ship's training simulator, running drills against holographic armies, or in the armory, meticulously maintaining their pulse rifles and combat armor. They spoke little, and when they did, it was in the clipped and precise language of their profession. They were the embodiment of the hegemony's final argument, the brutal punctuation at the end of every failed negotiation. I existed in the purgatory between these two worlds. The scientists treated me like a delicate, invaluable instrument, constantly asking me to describe the phantom sensations of the feedback, to quantify the echoes of the silence. Jorik's team treated me like an unexploded bomb. They watched my every move, their helmeted gazes unwavering, always maintaining a tactical distance. I was the mission's linchpin and its greatest liability, and the pressure of that duality was a constant, grinding weight. I spent most of my time in the ship's small observatory, a dark dome where the star fields were unobscured. I watched galaxies drift by like luminous dust motes, trying to find a sense of scale, something to make the impending confrontation with the void feel smaller. But it didn't work. The silence of space was a comforting, empty thing. The silence of Xylos was a hungry presence, and with every light year we crossed, I could feel its phantom touch growing stronger. A cold spot at the base of my skull where the neural inhibitor was supposed to be protecting me. It wasn't a psychic broadcast, not a signal that could be detected, but a subtle warping of the etheric net itself, like a massive, invisible object casting a shadow in the psychic spectrum. No one else could feel it. But for me, it was as real as the ship's recycled air. As we neared the Xylos system, the feeling intensified. Thorn had me in the medbay, a web of biosensors monitoring my every physiological response. The neural inhibitor was active, a low thrum against my skull, but it was like trying to hold back the tide with a picket fence. The silence seeped through the cracks. It wasn't a sound, but a cessation of inner noise, the constant background hum of the Cygnus screams. My unwanted companions for years began to fade, not into peace, but into a deeper, more profound emptiness. It was like going deaf in my soul. On the view screen, Xylos grew from a pinprick of light into a swirling ball of red and ochre. From orbit, it was deceptively beautiful. Its rust-colored deserts carved by ancient, dried-up riverbeds. There were no signs of cities, no artificial lights, nothing to suggest the presence of a species that had just casually annihilated the pinnacle of hegemony technology. The only evidence of the recent past was a vast, circular patch of black glass near the equator, a scar where the seraphim had died. It was Jorik who pinpointed our landing zone. "Here," he said, pointing to a spot on the holographic map, 50 kilometers from the blast site. A series of canyons, geologically stable, multiple points of egress and defensible positions. We'll establish a base camp, from which Dr. Thorn can conduct his research sorties. The descent was tense. The whisper shed its stealth skin, its black hull shimmering as it hit the thin atmosphere. We landed in a plume of red dust, the ship's engines powering down into an eerie quiet. For a long moment, no one moved. We were here. We were inside the bell jar. Jorik was the first one out, his pulse rifle raised, his enforcers forming a tight perimeter around the landing ramp. The air was thin and cold, carrying the metallic tang of oxidized rock. The sky was a pale, washed-out crimson, and a pair of small, swift moons were already visible. Thorn and his team followed, their faces a mixture of scientific excitement and primal fear. I was the last to emerge, stepping onto the red soil of Xylos. The moment my boots touched the ground, the silence hit me with the force of a physical blow. It was absolute. The inhibitor flared with a sharp, cold sensation, but it was overwhelmed. The last vestiges of the Cygnus screams in my head vanished, snuffed out like a candle flame. The familiar chatter of my own inner monologue, the stream of anxieties and memories that defined my consciousness, guttered and died. I was left in a state of pure, unadulterated awareness, a mind stripped bare. I could feel the grit of the dust under my boots, see the precise way the alien light cast shadows from the rocks, hear the faint, rhythmic pulse of my own blood in my ears. My senses were heightened, sharpened to an impossible degree, but the internal landscape of my mind was a barren desert. It was terrifying, and it was beautiful. Jorik's voice crackled in my comms, jarringly loud. "Kalen, status report. What do you feel?" I struggled to form a response. The act of translating pure sensory input into language felt clumsy, artificial. It's quiet. I finally managed, the words sounding alien in my own mouth. Completely quiet. Inside. "Stay sharp," he ordered. The silence might be a precursor to a physical attack. But I knew he was wrong. The silence was the attack. It wasn't a weapon they used. It was the world they lived in. And they were simply sharing it. We set up the base camp with practiced efficiency. Prefabricated shelters expanded from their compact forms. Sensor arrays were deployed. And a defensive perimeter of automated turrets was established. It was a tiny island of hegemony order in an ocean of alien emptiness. For the first 2 days, we saw nothing. Thorne's team sent out drones, which returned with stunningly detailed images of the barren landscape and readings that showed no unusual energy signatures. Orcs' men ran constant patrols, their black armor stark against the red rock. They reported nothing. No life. No movement. Nothing. The planet felt dead. I was the only one who knew it wasn't. The silence was a constant presence, a pressure against my mind. It didn't threaten. It simply was. I found myself becoming more and more detached, my thoughts slowing, my emotional responses blunting. I would stand for hours just watching the alien sun crawl across the sky. My mind a placid lake of pure sensation. On the 3rd day, Thorne decided he needed to collect samples from a location several kilometers from the camp. "We need to get boots on the ground, away from the ship's interference," he argued. Jorik reluctantly agreed, assigning 2 of his enforcers to escort Thorne, 1 of his biologists, and me. We traveled in a small, open-topped rover, the silence broken only by the crunch of its wheels on the gravelly terrain. The canyons were a maze of towering red rock, sculpted by eons of wind into haunting, organic shapes. As we moved deeper, the feeling of the silence intensified, and I felt the inhibitor at my neck begin to hum with strain. It was working overtime to keep my consciousness from completely dissolving into the background emptiness. We reached a small, sheltered cove where Thorne had detected unusual mineral deposits, while he and the biologist, a young woman named Alara, began taking readings and collecting rock samples. The enforcers and I stood guard. And that's when we saw them. They didn't emerge from a cave or come over a ridge. One moment, there was nothing but rock. And the next, they were there, standing on the canyon rim above us. 3 of them. They were exactly as the Seraphim's final. Fragmented images had shown impossibly tall and slender, their limbs long and graceful. Their skin was the color of pale stone, and they wore no clothing. Their faces were smooth, featureless expanses, with no visible eyes, no mouth, no sensory organs of any kind. They just stood there, unmoving, their blank faces turned towards us. The 2 enforcers immediately raised their rifles, targeting lasers painting crimson dots on the silent figures. "Hold your fire!" Thorne yelled, his voice tight with a mixture of terror and scientific ecstasy. "Don't shoot!" Jorik's voice came over our private comms, cold and clear. "Enforcers, you hold position. Do not engage unless they make a hostile move. Kalen." "What are you getting?" I didn't answer. I was transfixed. The silence pouring off them was immense, a tangible wave that washed over us. The inhibitor was screaming now, a high-frequency vibration against my iodine. I could feel the edges of my own identity starting to fray. And then, one of them moved. It didn't walk or run. It simply flowed down the canyon wall, its form momentarily losing cohesion becoming a river of pale stone before reforming at the bottom. Not 20 meters from our rover, the movement was utterly silent, utterly alien. It was like watching a law of physics being casually rewritten. The lead enforcer, a man named Corvus, didn't hesitate. "Hostile movement detected," he stated in his flat, combat protocol voice, and opened fire. The pulse rifle discharged with a sharp, crackling hiss, a bolt of pure energy lancing across the space between them. The bolt hit the Silenti square in the chest and vanished. There was no impact, no scorch mark, no reaction. The energy was simply gone, absorbed into the void. The Silenti didn't even flinch. It stood there, a perfect null state, a being of absolute absence. Corvus fired again, a sustained burst this time. Bolt after bolt of energy disappeared into the creature. It was like shooting at a hole in the universe. And then, the Silenti raised a long, slender arm. It didn't point. It didn't make a gesture of threat. It simply held its hand out, palm facing Corvus. The enforcer's rifle glowed red-hot, and then, with a soft, metallic sigh, it began to come apart. Not an explosion, but a quiet, clean disassembly. Screws unscrewed themselves. Plates of armor detached and fell to the ground. The power cell went inert. In seconds, the advanced pulse rifle was reduced to a neat pile of its component parts on the red dust. Corvus stood there, holding the useless stock, his helmet hiding his shock. The second enforcer, seeing his partner disarmed, turned to fire. The same thing happened. His rifle deconstructed in midair. It wasn't telekinesis. It wasn't a destructive force. It was an undoing, a localized application of entropy. The silence wasn't just a psychic phenomenon. It was a physical one. They didn't just absorb energy. They could unravel the complex systems that held matter together. I finally found my voice, a ragged whisper into the calm. "Yorick, they're not just quiet. They're unraveling things. Our technology, it's just a complicated noise to them. They can unmake it." I looked from the dismantled rifles to the silent, featureless face of the creature before us. We hadn't come here with a gun to the head of science. We had come into a cathedral of silence with a lit match, and the gods of this place were showing us, with infinite, terrifying patience, that they could simply choose to extinguish the flame. The age of noise was over. My sprint across the compound was a study in pure focus. The world narrowed to the back of Jorik's black armored form, the humming communications console, and the 30-minute countdown that had just begun in my head. The frantic shouts of Thorn's team, the metallic clang of the enforcer's boots, the blaring klaxons, it was all a distant, irrelevant symphony. The silence had not blunted my instincts, it had honed them. I moved with a desperate animal grace I hadn't possessed since my days as a pilot, my body a simple tool in service of a single, clear objective. Jorik was focused on the console, his fingers flying across the holographic interface, inputting the final authorization codes for Protocol 0. He didn't see me coming until I was almost upon him. He turned, his face a mask of cold surprise, his hand instinctively dropping to the pulse pistol holstered at his hip. He was fast, but my purpose was faster. I didn't try to fight him head-on. That would be suicide. Instead, I threw my body low, hooking my leg around his ankle and pulling with all my strength. He stumbled, his balance compromised for a crucial half-second. It was enough. I slammed my shoulder into the back of his knees, and the armored giant went down with a crash of metal on the deck plating. The console flickered, the authorization sequence timing out. I scrambled for the console, my hands slapping against the smooth, cool surface, trying to find a way to abort the command. But Yorick was a creature of pure combat. He roared, a sound of frustrated fury, and kicked out, his armored boot catching Umsi in the ribs. The impact was a starburst of pain that momentarily shattered the calm in my mind. I flew backward, tumbling across the deck. He was on his feet in an instant, his pulse pistol in his hand, its barrel glowing with lethal intent. "Traitor," he snarled, the word a venomous hiss. "You've let them into your head. You're nothing but their puppet now." He raised the pistol, the aim steady, centered on my chest. This was it, a pathetic, ignominious end on a dusty, forgotten world, killed not by an alien entity, but by the rigid, fearful dogma of my own kind. I closed my eyes, and in the darkness, I didn't see my life flash before me. I saw only the serene, featureless faces on the ridge, and I felt a strange sense of acceptance, but the shot never came. There was a soft, metallic sigh, the same sound I had heard in the canyon. I opened my eyes. Yorick was staring at his pistol in disbelief. It was quietly, gracefully, disassembling itself in his hand. The power cell clattered to the floor. The targeting scope detached. The casing split into its component halves. He was left holding a useless piece of metal, his expression a perfect portrait of bewildered rage. I looked past him, towards the open entrance of the command tent. A single Silenti stood there. It hadn't been there a second ago. It had not walked in. It had simply arrived. It was a silent, pale sentinel, its presence utterly calm, its featureless face turned towards us. The klaxons in the camp sputtered and died. The flashing emergency lights went dark, one by one. Every piece of active hegemony technology in the compound was being gently, inexorably put to sleep. The Silenti's silent intervention had saved my life, but it had also sealed our fate in Jorik's mind. His face, already a mask of grim determination, hardened into something terrifying. This was no longer a tactical decision for him. It was a holy war against an incomprehensible devil. "It doesn't matter," he said, his voice a low, chilling whisper as he dropped the useless pistol stock. The command was sent. The whisper's reactor has begun its overload sequence. 28 minutes. You've only delayed the inevitable. You've condemned us all. He turned and sprinted from the tent. His objective clear: get to the rover and save himself. Corvus and Rorik, having seen their captain's sidearm dismantled, were momentarily frozen, their absolute faith in their technology shattered. But their loyalty was unshakable. They began to fall back towards the rover, laying down suppressing fire with their rifles. The bolts of energy sizzled through the air, hitting the Silenti in the tent's entrance, and vanished without a trace. It was like trying to shoot a ghost. Thorn ran to my side, helping me to my feet. My ribs screamed in protest. "Kalen, what do we do?" "We have to get to the ship. Try to reverse the overload." "There's no time," I gasped, the pain making it hard to breathe. "And even if we made it, the ship's systems will be just as useless as those rifles. They won't let us." The fourth enforcer, and the one who had been sent to plant the demolition charge, now stood near the rover, his rifle also undone. He looked lost, his programming utterly scrambled. Yorick reached him, grabbing him by the shoulder. "The rover, let's go." That's an order. But the rover wouldn't start. Its engine was dead. Its console dark. Every piece of their advanced, powerful technology was now just inert metal and plastic. They were stranded. Jorik let out a roar of pure, primal fury, a sound that seemed to tear at the very fabric of the silence. He was a caged wolf, stripped of his teeth and claws, and he was staring into the eyes of the calm, patient zookeeper. Then, the Silenti in the tent raised its long, slender arm, not towards Joris, but towards me. And in the perfect quiet of my mind, the invitation I had felt earlier returned, no longer a gentle pull, but a clear, undeniable imperative. Come, witness, understand. I knew what I had to do. Thorn, I said, my voice urgent, gather your team, get your samples, your data slates, whatever you can carry. Trust me. Trust you, Kalen. We're all going to die in less than 25 minutes, he cried, his face slick with sweat. They're not going to let the planet die, I said, with a certainty that was absolute, that came from a place beyond logic. They're not going to let us die. They just want us to listen. I turned and walked out of the command tent, past the silent, watching creature, and started walking towards the ridge where the others stood. I didn't look back. I could hear Thorn shouting my name, then shouting at his team to grab their gear. I could hear Jorik screaming threats and curses, his rage a pathetic, impotent noise in the vast, calm emptiness. My walk across the dusty plain was a pilgrimage. With every step, the silence deepened, and my connection to it grew stronger. The pain in my ribs faded into a distant signal. The ticking clock of Protocol Zero ceased to matter. The world of human fear and human violence receded behind me. I felt as if I were wading out into a cool, clear ocean, leaving a burning, chaotic shore behind. As I neared the base of the ridge, the dozen Silenti flowed down to meet me. They moved with that impossible liquid grace, surrounding me in a silent circle. They didn't touch me, but I could feel their presence as a palpable field, a zone of profound and utter peace. There was no menace, no judgment. There was only a deep, resonant stillness. In the center of that circle, with my former comrades watching from the doomed camp behind me, my perspective shifted. I was no longer just Kalen, the broken pilot. I felt my consciousness expand, link with the silent circle around me, and through them, I felt the planet. It was not a hive mind, not a collective consciousness in the way Thorn had theorized. It was a single, unified state of being. The Silenti were not individuals in the human sense. They were focal points, temporary expressions of a planet-wide field of existence that had achieved a perfect systemic equilibrium. They were the planet's way of thinking, of perceiving, of being. The rocks, the dust, the thin air, the creatures themselves, it was all one quiet, harmonic system. And I saw our arrival from their perspective. The Seraphim had not been a ship. It had been a scream. Its psychic broadcast was a wave of chaotic, disordered noise that had threatened the planet's perfect equilibrium. Lyra's mind, full of duty and fear and a billion other complex, noisy human thoughts, was a discordant note that had to be silenced. The frame's destruction was not an act of war. It was an act of healing. It was the planet calming a fever. Our technology, our weapons, Our very way of being, it was all a form of sickness to them, a chaotic, unsustainable, and ultimately self-destructive complexity. The unraveling was not destruction. It was a form of therapy. They were simplifying the chaos, returning the systems to their quiet, elemental state. They were showing us the path back to a peace we had forgotten was possible. From the ridge, I watched the Whisper, our ghost ship, our pinnacle of stealth technology. To the Silenti, it was a tumor, a pocket of violent, unstable energy that had embedded itself in their world. The overload sequence Jorik had initiated was the tumor becoming cancerous, threatening to destroy the entire system, and I watched as the planet healed itself. The ground around the Whisper began to shimmer. The red dust and rock began to flow, not like a landslide, but like a tide. The earth itself rose up, a silent, graceful wave of stone and sand, and enveloped the ship. There was no violence, no explosion. The ship was simply absorbed, swallowed by the planet. The seismic charge, the overloading reactor, the threat of annihilation, it was all cocooned, neutralized, and returned to the Earth. The complex energy of the core being quietly, systematically, simplified back into the planet's own balanced energy field. Protocol Zero had failed. The hegemony's ultimate weapon had been nullified with the geological equivalent of a gentle, maternal sigh. The 30-minute countdown was over. We were still alive. I stood there, surrounded by the Silenti, a bridge between two impossibly different forms of existence. Thorn and his team were staring from the edge of the camp, their faces filled with a new, profound awe. Jorik and his enforcers were on their knees, their armored forms slumped in defeat, their entire worldview undone. They had come here as conquerors, as judges and executioners, and they had been rendered utterly, completely irrelevant. The hegemony had sent a stethoscope to listen to the silence, but the silence was listening back, and it had just shown us that it was not the patient. It was the physician, and we, all of humanity, were the disease. The age of human noise ended not with a bang, but with the quiet, inexorable swallowing of a warship by a planet of dust. In the aftermath, a new kind of silence fell upon our ragged camp, a silence born not of emptiness, but of utter, soul-shaking revelation. We were the last echoes of a song that the universe had finished singing. Jorik and his enforcers remained on their knees, not in surrender, but in a state of conceptual shock. Their armor, once a symbol of indomitable will, now seemed like a hollow shell, its purpose rendered meaningless. Their world of orders, threats, and tactical solutions had been dismantled as easily as their rifles. Thorn and his team, meanwhile, were experiencing a form of religious rapture. They moved about the camp with a dazed, reverent air, their data slates forgotten, their scientific method wholly inadequate. They were astronomers who had just been personally introduced to God and found that God was not a person, but a place, a state of being. I stood on the ridge, the circle of Silenti around me a zone of perfect tranquility. My consciousness, still linked to theirs, was a vast and placid ocean. The frantic, desperate ego of Kalen was a distant island in that ocean, a memory of a shore I had left long ago. I understood. I understood what came next. There was no malice in them, no desire for revenge or conquest. The planet had defended itself, had healed the wound we represented. Now, it was a matter of quarantine. We were a contagion, and they were deciding how to cure us without killing the host. I turned and flowed down the ridge, my movements unconsciously mimicking theirs. The circle of Silenti followed, their presence a calming balm. I walked back into the camp, back into the heart of my species' fear and confusion. Jorik looked up as I approached. His face, visible through his retracted helmet, was a ruin of broken certainties. "What are you?" he whispered, the question not directed at me, but at the silent figures behind me. "We are the answer to a question you never thought to ask," I said. And the words were mine, but the thought behind them was as vast and old as the planet itself. The question is, what happens when the noise stops? I turned to Thorn. "They are offering us a choice." The scientist's eyes were wide. "A choice of two paths." I explained, the concepts translating themselves into my clumsy human language. The first is the path of silence, to stay here, to let go of the complex, chaotic, individual consciousness that causes so much pain and fear, to be simplified, to become part of the planet's equilibrium, to find peace. Ilara, Thorn's young biologist, looked from me to the Silenti, her face alight with a fierce, burning curiosity, to be integrated to join them, to become them. I clarified. Or rather, to become what they are, a part of this place, the end of you, and the beginning of something else. "And the second path?" Thorn asked, his voice trembling. "The second path is to go back," I said, "to return to the noise. But you cannot go back as you are. The contagion of your technology, of your violent thoughts, cannot be allowed to leave. You can return, but you will return. Simplified, you will be the message." A low, guttural laugh came from Jorik. He struggled to his feet, his massive armored frame looking more like a cage than a suit of armor. "A message. I am a captain in the Ether Corps. I am the fist of the hegemony. I am not some damn poet's verse to be delivered." He was rallying, his broken world view being hastily rebuilt on the only foundation he had left defiance. "And how do you propose we leave?" they ate our ship. As if in answer, the ground 50 meters from the camp began to tremble, not violently, but with a soft, rhythmic pulse. The red earth swirled and rose, not like a wave this time, but like a potter's clay on a wheel. From the planet's surface, a new shape emerged. It was a ship, or the memory of one. It had the basic form of the Whisper's emergency shuttle, but it was sleeker, simpler. Its hull the color of pale, smooth stone, the same color as the Silenti themselves. There were no weapon ports, no sensor arrays, no complex engine signatures. It was a seed pod, a vessel of pure function. "They are giving us a way home," I said quietly. "It's a trick," Jorik spat. "A Trojan horse. We get inside, and it turns us into one of them, or buries us with the Whisper." "No," Thorn breathed, walking slowly towards the new ship, his hand outstretched as if to touch a holy relic. "It's a gift. It's a lesson. Look at the power systems. They're not based on fusion or antimatter. It's a resonant frequency drive. It's powered by the same principles they use to move. It's elegant. It's perfect." The choice was laid before us. Ilara was the first to decide. She turned to Thorn, her eyes filled with a sad, beautiful resolve. "I'm staying. Eris," she said, "my entire life. I've been studying the what of the universe. This is a chance to understand the why. I can't go back to dissecting alien fungi after this. This is the truth." Two of Thorne's other researchers, after a moment of silent contemplation, nodded in agreement. They would stay. They would take the path of silence. Thorne was torn, his soul caught between his duty as a scientist to observe and his desire as a man to know. He looked at the stone-like ship, then at his students who were preparing to shed their humanity like a worn-out coat. "I have to report this," he said, his voice thick with regret. "I have to tell them. They need to know. I knew my path. I was the bridge. I had been broken by the hegemony's noise and remade by the planet's silence. I was the only one who could truly translate what had happened here. I had to be the message. That left Yorick and his enforcers, Corvus and Rorik, their faces pale and drawn, looked to their captain, awaiting orders that would never come. Their programming was shattered. The fourth enforcer simply sat on the ground, rocking back and forth, his mind lost somewhere in the quiet. "No," Yorick said, his voice a low growl. He drew his combat knife, the last piece of complex, violent technology he possessed. "I will not be a part of your alien experiment. I will not be your specimen or your messenger boy. I will die as I lived a soldier of the Terran hegemony." He charged, not at the Silenti, but at the elegant, silent ship, the knife raised high, a final and futile act of noisy defiance. He never reached it. The Silenti did not move. They did not raise a hand. They simply were. As Yorick ran, a ripple seemed to pass through the air around him. His knife dissolved, the metal turning to red dust that puffed away on the thin breeze. Then his armor, piece by piece, unmade itself, the plates and servos and fiber bundles falling away, returning to their elemental components. He was left in his thin, black undersuit, stumbling forward, stripped of his power, his identity. He fell to his knees, not a soldier anymore, but a terrified, screaming man, his cries shockingly loud in the profound quiet. He was not harmed. He was simply simplified, left with nothing but the noise in his own head, a prisoner in a kingdom of silence. We left them there, Jork and his broken men, and Ilara and the others who had chosen their new path. As Thorne and I and the few remaining scientists boarded the stone-like shuttle, I saw Ilara take a Silenti's hand. As their fingers touched, she began to shimmer, her form losing its sharp, human edges, slowly, peacefully, dissolving into the quiet tide of the planet. She was going home. The journey back was a silent one. The ship flew itself, its course locked on the sword of Damocles. There was no hum of engines, only a faint, resonant vibration that I could feel in my bones. A lullaby of silence. When we arrived, they were waiting for us. Valerius stood in the docking bay, flanked by enforcers, his face an unreadable mask of iron. He saw our strange, organic-looking shuttle, saw our thinned ranks, saw the haunted, changed look in Thorne's eyes, and the profound, unnerving calm in mine. I stepped off the ramp and walked towards him, the left side of my face, once a frozen, palsied ruin, was smooth. The involuntary twitch was gone. The scars remained, but they were just marks on the skin now, not a map of my inner torment. I was whole. Kalen, Valerius said, his voice tight. Report. What happened to my ship? What happened to Captain Jorik? Your ship has been simplified. Director, I said, and my voice was calm and clear, without a trace of the rasp it once held. And Captain Jorik has been introduced to a form of peace he was unable to comprehend. I met his cold, analytical gaze without flinching. We built an empire on the belief that peace is a type of order that must be imposed. We were wrong. True peace is not a system you build. It is the equilibrium you return to when all the noisy, complex systems have failed. We thought our echo frames were angels, but they were just shouting into a storm, trying to drown out the sound of a universe that is, at its heart, perfectly and eternally silent. Xylos didn't destroy our angel. Director, it just taught it how to listen. I stood before him, not as his broken pilot, but as an ambassador from a place he could never conquer. I was the message. The lie of the hegemony's peace was over, because I had returned carrying the memory of a real one, and my silence was a sound they would never, ever be able to unhear.